right. I'm so excited that there are so many people here. I really thought with the architectural tour and the gorgeous day that we might be down to like a handful of folks. So thank you guys all for walking over here and coming to our session. I'm Nell Zeal with the Maryland Historical Trust. I'm going to talk a little bit about what MHT has been doing to help, primarily help local governments, but help others as well, prepare for natural hazards and climate change going forward for their historical properties and cultural resources. And then we're going to hear from the city of Baltimore and from Calvert County about some local examples of what they're dealing with and some approaches that they've been experimenting with locally. Before we get started today, I wanted to kind of get a sense of who is in the room. If you're with a local government, can you raise your hand? All right, got a few folks. State government? All right, a few more folks. Nonprofit? Great. Private sector? All right, so it's a nice mix. That's awesome. At the end of the session, we're going to give our remarks. We're going to try to keep it short because we would like to have a conversation about what you're seeing in your community. We'd love to hear from you about things that we can do to help you as you're dealing with properties and with some of the things that you're experiencing. And then also, if you have information that you'd like to share with other people here, that would be a good time to do that as well. All right, any questions before we get started? Okay. So today, mostly I'm going to talk about a program that we've developed called Weather It Together. This is something that is, it's a suite of resources and training opportunities related to hazard mitigation planning, disaster response and recovery, and climate adaptation for historic properties and cultural resources. We're just getting started now, really with a focus on flooding, but we do expect to be able to expand to other natural hazards going forward. Flooding, of course, is what we're experiencing the most right now, and probably what we'll be hearing from you folks. The Weather It Together name actually comes from the pilot project that we worked on with the city of Annapolis. Who's familiar with the city of Annapolis Weather It Together project? Okay. So it was the first attempt in the country to plan for sea level rise and historic properties at a community-based level. So the Annapolis Colonial Historic District is very vulnerable, even to tidal flooding, to nuisance flooding. And so that's one of the reasons that a lot of our guidance is really focused on the hazard mitigation planning process, which is not for the disastrous events. So disaster preparedness is somewhat different. This is the sort of creeping encroachment of water over time. And sort of sunny day flooding is another thing that they call it. And so we have really targeted a lot of our resources toward that process. But they were kind enough to allow us to use the Weather It Together tagline and the logo concept for our statewide program as well. And any other local jurisdictions that want to undertake this work can do the same thing. This is what our web pages look like. I encourage you to go to our website at your convenience. You can find a link to it from our homepage. It says Weather It Together on the left-hand side. But we have these categories, as I mentioned. Oh, I have a clicker. Hazard mitigation planning, disaster response and recovery, and climate change planning. And then on the left-hand side of each, we have a lot of resources for you to dig deeper and learn more. So as I mentioned, we've had a focus on flooding so far. This really came about because we saw the sea level rise maps and started to understand really that some of our most significant historic and cultural resources in the state were going to be affected by sea level rise over time. So this, I don't know how many of you have seen these maps. This light blue area here, so this is Dorchester County, for instance. This light blue area is the 2-foot inundation, which we're asking people to plan for by 2050. So that gives you a sense. Dorchester County is projected to go from being the 4th largest county in Maryland to the 14th largest county over time. So we have a lot of sites at risk. These red areas here are Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties listings. So this image actually comes from an interactive map that we have on the Weather It Together site, where you can see the inundation layers along with our Maryland inventory data if you want to browse and look at what you have in your area. So one of the things that we've developed recently is this tome called the Flood Mitigation Guide for Maryland's Historic Buildings, and I'll pass it around. This is all available electronically on our website. It distills all of our best guidance for how to do this work, how to integrate it into hazard mitigation planning. It builds on the guidance that FEMA has produced, which is called Integrating Historic and Cultural Resource Considerations into Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is a beautiful title. But this is much more expansive. It's Maryland specific. We would definitely recommend that if you're interested in undertaking this work, by all means use the FEMA guidance. FEMA will be using the FEMA guidance when they come to help you in the case of a disaster. But we also, we've provided some different ways of looking at prioritization of resources and other suggested changes to the framework. We also have training modules available online dealing with specific topics within this guidance. So you can, if you're more of an audio oral learner, you can do it that way, or you can browse this by topic as well. So on our Weather It Together page, as I mentioned, we have training modules. We have a combined architectural and flood vulnerability assessment form. So if you have properties that are in the flood zone that you already know, you've mapped it, and you're interested in doing a combined update for efficiency purposes of both the flood vulnerability and the historic properties, we have that information and guidance available. And then, as I mentioned, we also have links to additional resources. One of the things that we're doing differently for hazard mitigation planning, the timeline is typically 5 years. We are asking people to look at a mortgage cycle when they're undertaking this, basically, to look at the 30-year climate projections and to integrate that into their hazard mitigation plans, so that rather than the 5-year cycle, because things are moving exponentially, this will at least give you a sense of, you know, where there will be vulnerabilities going forward. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on disaster response and recovery. This is obviously related to climate adaptation because we have more frequent, more intense storms. We do have resources available for that as well. You've probably seen a lot. The National Trust has developed a lot. We've developed our own specific response resources for historic properties. Ellicott City, of course, is, I know, very fresh in our minds. For climate adaptation, I will say this is the beginning of a conversation. We've been doing this work for about 3 years now, and I can't tell you how much it's evolved and how many people have become engaged in this process that were not involved when we started. So it's really growing very fast, and it's important for us to have these conversations. So it's at conferences like these, and when we can network together to share stories. And I would really like to hear from you if you're experiencing things in your region, if there are things that we can put on our Weather It Together page to share with other communities. That's really helpful for us as well. Heritage has a really important role to play in climate adaptation. It's frequently, so far, very focused on environmental trends and environmental interventions. We feel like the sense of place, and the Annapolis Project was a good illustration of this, that the historic community can really serve as a focal point for planning. Historically, marginalized communities, so that's part of our legacy as well, are frequently most vulnerable. We saw that in Katrina, and we will see that going forward. There's been articles written on Baltimore City as well, of showcasing that the poverty compounds these issues. I'm happy to say that the Maryland Historical Trust is very integrated into the state's overall efforts for climate planning. So Maryland is very lucky to have a Climate Change Commission on the state level. And I'm going to skip ahead. So the Climate Change Commission works via 4 working groups. We participate in the Adaptation and Resiliency Working Group. And through that, we are hoping to develop additional programs, especially targeted to local governments, to help them undertake this work. But some of the key questions that I think we as a community of preservationists and people involved in this kind of work really need to ask ourselves. There will be loss and change. So we are charged with trying to manage change over time and to try to protect place in a way that is responsible and carries our past into the future. It's hard to know how we should do that going forward in some of these communities, especially where there really aren't a lot of mitigation options. There are questions about how we prioritize buildings and archeological sites. The answer about what is significant coming from a professional perspective may be very different from what the community thinks is important. There will be ecosystem changes, and we'll see those before we see a lot of the effects to the built environment. We need to ask ourselves how that relates to heritage. And then climate change will have an impact on traditions and intangible heritage as well. And those of us that are in the preservation community focused more on the built environment, I think, need to be thinking expansively about what that means and how all of those community legacies work together and will be affected going forward. Maryland is offering a Climate Leadership Academy for those of you who are interested. I think they're starting their 3rd cohort. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources is spearheading this effort. I highly recommend, if you're interested in this, to participate in that. And for next steps for us at the state level, we're noticing that most communities really need to do basic research about the historic properties that are at risk and the archeological sites that are at risk. We're trying to support that through the Certified Local Government Grant Program, through MHT, and also the non-capital grant program, and happy to talk to anybody about that after this session. At the state level, we recognize that we need better modeling for the heavy precipitation events that we're seeing. We have good data for sea level rise, but I'm sure we've all been experiencing these more frequent and intense rainstorms that are causing flash floods. We're working currently on archaeology guidance for local communities, and we'll make that available. I mentioned the expanded local government training. The National Park Service swears that it is coming out with a brief and guidelines to help us, so we'll be developing training around that once those are available. And like I said, we're also going to be looking at natural hazards beyond flooding going forward. So we are actually going to save questions until the end after we've all done our presentations. But I'd like to turn it over now to Walter Gallis from the City of Baltimore.
Thank you very much. I think this is a really distracting place to try to do a presentation. But anyway, thank you so much. My name's Walter Gallis. I'm a planner in the Department of Planning in the City of Baltimore. And then within that, within the division called Historical and Architectural Preservation, we have the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation, and so our acronym commonly for the division is CHAP. People just call us CHAP. Sometimes they call it CHAPS, but we're CHAP. So I'm here to talk about primarily, pardon me, this document. You can see we don't quite measure up to the state's document, but what I'm mainly going to talk about and get to is our some flood mitigation guidelines that we put together specifically for the Fells Point neighborhood in Baltimore that actually can serve as a model for other neighborhoods, but it was part of a bigger effort in the city. Those of you who are from here or know Baltimore and know this area know that Baltimore isn't stranger to flooding events either. Certainly this is from, whether it could be like flooding, tidal flooding from the inner harbor. I think these pictures are from Isabel, and this is Fells Point. And this image from Meadow Mill along our waterways, the Jones Falls flooded. This is the same on the same date as the Ellicott City flood in July 30th, 2016. This is Meadow Mill. In 2013, the Department of Planning produced a document called Disaster Preparedness and Planning Project. We call it DP3. And it was a comprehensive approach to hazard mitigation, trying to address the impacts of climate change, dealing with and the impacts of heat waves, sea level rise, increased precipitation and flooding. And then in 2018, it was updated. There was new science. The city had experienced further events, weather-related and climate change-related events. And the city was also keeping up very, very well with the requirements from the federal government to continue to update its disaster mitigation plans each time, because we're very much a player in the what's called the community rating system tied to the federal the flood insurance program, and keeping those flood insurance rates down as much as possible by going over and above even the federal requirements for what's needed for participation in that program. And let me just read what the 2018 DP3 said about what it was trying to do. The 2018 DP3 incorporates strategies to increase the city's adaptive capacity to withstand the impacts of more frequent and intense extreme weather events and quickly bounce back from any disruptions. Now, in that DP3, there were 8 strategies laid out for historic resources. We pulled out 3 of those 8 because these are very ambitious, and we pulled out 3 of them to try to at least to begin to address. Develop and implement a hazard mitigation planning strategy for the city's historic resources, integrate a variety of tools, prioritize all historic resources. We haven't done that yet, but that's a goal, right? That's a strategy. And develop a schedule to complete investigations, and then develop a historic property resiliency toolkit. What we did was the product of we wrote a grant to it was the Department of Planning through the Maryland Historical Trust received a grant from the National Park Service's Cultural Resources Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and that's what enabled us to begin to address those three very ambitious strategies. And so the product is this. This is available on our website. I'll have the address again at the end of the last slide, but we're at chap.baltimorecity.gov. Very, very simple to find, and this document is on there. And what I want to do is lead you through just a few parts of that document, because it's kind of a combination of an educational document as well as guidance, a guidebook, and design guidelines. Dominique Hawkins of Preservation Design Partnership LLC of Philadelphia was instrumental in helping us develop this document, and we worked closely with our own Office of Sustainability and our floodplain managers in developing the text. And Dominique was instrumental also, and you saw the state document. She had very much a role in that document as well. So the focus on Fells Point is very intentional, given its location along Baltimore's inner harbor. Makes it highly vulnerable, as you can see from this digital flood insurance rate map from the state of Maryland. Many of you know Fells Point, perhaps better even than I do. its early history, its 18th and 19th century streetscapes, its relationship to the water, that's why it's there. It was involved in shipping, shipbuilding, and it's one of the neighborhoods of Baltimore, certainly, that would be the most impacted by flooding. By focusing just right now on this document on Fells Point, it made the task manageable. It wasn't so overwhelming that we were going to try to tackle the whole city. But it was also important to us because so much of the guidance that you get, even from FEMA, about how to do any kind of flood mitigation seems to assume that the flood mitigation is for detached houses. And that's not at all the case. In this kind of guidance, their case, you go to the back of the guidance of this document from 2012, and the guidance is involves relocation as an option, or elevation of individual houses. Or one of their other examples was building, in effect, a flood wall around a historic house. Well, if you have detached, that's fine if you have detached properties, but if you have row upon row upon row of row houses, as we do in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, that's certainly not the case. And Philadelphia, though, is another case in point. These are the sections that it covers, and as I said, even if you're not going to use it per se for, if you're not in Baltimore, the introductory sections are really well done. I think Ms. Hawkins did a really good job of setting the stage, because it doesn't go right into the guidelines, and here's the things you have to do. It first sets the stage for you with things like defining terms. All of us who work with governmental entities, especially the federal government, get used to hearing the acronyms. We even have acronyms, and here's the acronyms that you become very familiar with when you're in this business. And how specialized it is. Now, it's organized into, when it gets to the guidelines part, it's organized in two ways. It breaks down the flood mitigation efforts into basic, what we're to call basic improvements, and then building alterations. And basic improvements are the things, many of which are lower cost, certainly, and not as extensive, but could be simple things like simple maintenance of your property to reduce its vulnerability. Things like here we talk about repairing your masonry and so forth. But it could also be clearing your site of debris, removing clutter and unnecessary storage, replacing siding, clearing drains and downspouts, keeping shutters operable. So it's keeping your property up, being a good steward of your property. And then other examples of basic improvements that are a little bit, how much? 30 seconds. Okay. I'm so sorry. The other improvements are things like this, where you would do, elevate your property. This is the most sobering section of it, where we talk about wet flood proofing, where you acknowledge that you may have to live with water, and you might have ground floor uses that you couldn't use, and that your basement wouldn't be usable at all. And we use the example in Fells Point. And then this example too of using barriers for dry flood proofing. Barriers work, but look, there's that photo before. That barrier wasn't closed at Meadow Mill during that flooding. I'm sorry I didn't have a lot of more time, but that's the basic thing. I think our basic thoughts in putting this together was historic resources are important, but people's lives are important as well. And so you have to balance those two things. And sometimes you have to set historic preservation on its head and decide, how are you going to deal with the sobering reality of climate change. You have to protect human lives. That comes first. And then you also do, at the same time, have to look at your resources. And here's my information, but the main thing to just remember is chap.baltimorecity.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. So folks may have some specific questions about some of the mitigation options that Baltimore came up with, and we can talk about those at the end. But Kirsty Unila now is going to talk a little bit about the work that Calvert County has been doing.
Hi. In 2015, Marcy Rockman, who was then the Climate Change Adaptation Coordinator for the National Park Service, gave a webinar in which she challenged archaeologists like myself to find, identify, and communicate our climate stories to the various constituencies that we serve. And I think really that that's what we're all trying to do. Calvert County is currently smaller than Dorchester County, but in 50 years probably won't be. In any event, since the late 17th century, we've lost shorelines greater than 100 feet, and archeological sites and standing structures have gone with them. I want to briefly summarize some of the steps that Calvert County government has taken to identify our resources and quantify the vulnerability to increasingly violent storm events and flooding. I also want to suggest, as I think we all know, that we need to coordinate the roles of our various agencies that plan for and respond to potential and current effects of climate change. I like to think of this as kind of a small sock-shaped peninsula. You can see we're a wet sock. We're between the Chesapeake Bay and the Patuxent River. We have over 110 miles of shoreline, but yet we're only 9 miles across at the widest point and just 30 miles long, with tons of tidal creeks. Like the rest of the Chesapeake, Calvert experiences the effect of higher relative sea level, exacerbated by the subsidence of land. So we have to consider the effects on our communities as we plan and now have to include cultural resources both above ground, below ground, and at the water's edge. Our environmental planners have worked hard on hazard mitigation and preparedness plans for a good deal of time and have integrated them into as many larger scale plans as possible. This map on the left shows the flood zones and the limits of intermediate wave action, which is referred to as LIMWA, it's fun to say, in the community on Brooms Island on the Patuxent. Those little deltas are not specific resources, those are actually the LIMWA, the limits of wave action. The map on the right shows Calvert County with all of the various kinds of cultural resources that we've mapped. Those include surveys, archaeological sites, standing structures, historic roads, etc. We've begun to consider those cultural resources within the communities, the environmental planners and our emergency planners and operations center study and try to address. Countywide, at least 78 structures on the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties are threatened by inundation of 0 to 5 feet, and more than 125 archaeological sites have been identified in areas that are vulnerable by the same measure. There's sure to be many more archaeological sites than that because our surveys aren't comprehensive, but I'll say more about that in just a minute. And when funds have allowed, the county's done some engineering studies to mitigate specific problems for historic architectural resources. For example, this is the Lore Oyster House in Solomons, which is a National Historic Landmark as well as exhibit space for the Calvert Marine Museum. Right now, it experiences nuisance flooding, so much so that it must close for a while on at least half the days that it's open. An engineering study identified that if we installed a couple of simple valves to keep out the tidal waters on the creek that it abuts, that would solve some of the problem, but it would not address things like extreme storm events, storm surges, etc. And in time, as the water comes up, there's not going to be any number of valves isn't going to solve the problem. Lore Oyster House, unlike others, can we consider it for elevation? that's a whole other can of worms. The county has applied for funds and has successfully raised a number of private residences and other structures out of reach of tidal waters. This photo, which you noticed on the cover of the document that Nell passed around, is of the Cove Point Lighthouse and Lighthouse Keeper's House, also on the National Register. This is shown after the storm surge of Hurricane Isabel. However, on a normal day at a normal high tide, if the sump pump in the basement of the Lighthouse Keeper's House isn't working, the high tide will infiltrate. With nothing apparent on the ground, it will infiltrate that basement to a depth of over a foot. Elevating or moving these structures is certainly a possibility, but at an unthinkable expense of public funds. Many archaeological sites around the county are eroding out of the banks along the waterways, and since we cannot study or save them all, the primary goals of our program are to identify, assess for vulnerability, and prioritize them for study or preservation or mitigation, which in most cases simply means digging them out of the ground. Over a period of 2 years, using CLG grant funds that Nell referenced, administered by the Maryland Historical Trust, we've conducted shoreline studies to specifically address the vulnerability of archaeological sites to rising water, storm surge, wave action, and when possible, changes in the water table. In 2016, Applied Archaeology and History Associates recorded 13 new sites on Battle Creek and assessed the previously recorded sites. The consultant recorded even more archaeological sites on Hunting Creek the following year, and in addition to exploring the shorelines to observe and record sites, we conducted a comprehensive vulnerability assessment of coastal cultural resources. We have a variety of data to use, including historic shorelines from 1841. We have enhanced the tools that environmental planners have used, importing more data layers and incorporating them into a portable geocortex viewer just for this purpose. It operates on iPads, phones, whatever. I'm not going to show you all the layers that we look at, but I want to give you a flavor of some of the things that can inform our assessments. And these are available to most of you if you will work with your GIS people. And you can do it right from a desktop, laptop, or tablet in the field, as I mentioned. Among the layers we consider are several types of access structures. These, such as piers, ramps, boathouses, et cetera. Each type is coded in geometric shape and color. Then come stabilization structures, such as bulkheads, et cetera. Riparian land uses include agriculture, residential, commercial, et cetera. Bank cover shows whether there's grass, what's on the bank, in other words. And also shore height and condition shows the height of banks in feet and degree to which they're eroded or undercut. And then finally, hurricane and storm surge shows the inundation and flooding that can be expected in a major hurricane or tropical storm event. In addition to these, we also consider soils, limuar, submerged aquatic vegetation, phragmites, beach buffers, marsh buffers, wetlands, and other layers, including aerial photography from as early as 1938. This is because a simple bathtub model of sea level rise just doesn't cut it for assessing the actual damage that the water can do. In order to make better assessments and plan more effectively, though, we really need better modeling that isn't dependent on surveys that have already been completed. Predictive models based solely on recorded site locations in Calvert County, like most places, are skewed by the surveys that have been done. Most of those have been driven by development. Our GIS team is currently assisting us in a new modeling tool that has, in part, the elements shown on this slide. The AMHT data referenced at the bottom can be accessed on site type level to make the model more useful to looking for archaeological sites. Some data sources, such as the Maryland stream data, quite frankly, really suck. So We're developing a comprehensive streams data layer in our county GIS. The effort is multi-departmental and will distinguish between the type of stream, intermittent or perennial, as well as identify the regulation to which they are subject. The layer will be produced using staff expertise, high-resolution LiDAR data, and other map sources. And we map spring heads as we find them. We have launched a project to map all of them. Vulnerable sites have been ranked for mitigation according to significance. Following the assessment of Battle Creek, the Calverton site, which was our first county seat, was judged the most vulnerable, and you can see why. So we launched 2 years of study and have just received a Maryland Heritage Areas grant to continue work at Calverton. In this case, a property owner gave us access to the site. Site protection would be preferable, but we've got no options here. We've been fortunate to use partnerships to identify, observe, and protect a number of historic and archeological properties through such organizations listed on this slide. This shows properties at the head of Battle Creek that we've been able to protect and open to for the use, enjoyment, and education of our citizens, who we hope will become stewards of our vulnerable resources. Thank you.